Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Counterfactual Gaming. And today I'm here with a gigantic Mega France and a bobbleheading deer to talk about resource shortages in Victoria 3. Now, if you see the deer at the lower right hand corner of the screen bobbing its head back and forth, you know that means I'm in debug mode. And I'm in debug mode with a France that has taken over the entire world because I want to look at more detail at the idea that the game doesn't have enough resources. And when I say resources, I'm talking about resource building specifically. I'm talking about iron, coal, sulfur, lead, that sort of thing. I'm also going to talk about agriculture a little bit, but I want to focus primarily on resources themselves. A large portion of Victoria 3's community has the idea that Victoria 3 does not have enough resources. And to the community's credit, yes, then when you're playing around in the game, you get to late game techs, no matter how long it takes you to get to those techs, you end up in a situation where you're starving for wood, iron, and coal to feed your industry. I want to look at this in more detail because there's a lot of moving parts to Victoria's economy, and there's a fundamental difference between the AI doesn't develop its resources enough versus there's just not enough resources on the map. And doing some tests here with a late game save that has the entire world annexed through cheats and using fastbuild and fasthire to sort of move the economy around in different ways makes it clear to me that the community is somewhat right about the lack of resources, but there's also some other weird stuff going on in Victoria's economy. And as I think we're going to discover, we have to ask ourselves what exactly enough resources would look like. I'm looking at the market screen for a reason as I say this. So before I talk about the economics of the late game, I want to sort of outline what I've done here using cheat codes. Is I've annexed the entire world to France. I took a save game I had as France at the end of the game and then just used cheats to annex the entire planet. I've got fast build and fast hire cheats enabled so that buildings constructed instantly and they will employ people to their capacity instantly when they have labor available. I've also used the research cheat to complete the entire tech tree. None of that's super important. What's important is that I've got all the techs, I've got a well-developed France, and I own the entire world. And what I did is I went into the save game, and once I annexed the world, and I used the fast build cheat to build out all the resource buildings except for the ones you see that got discovered recently, and I'm going to talk about those. All the resource buildings, build a whole bunch of factories, and build up a whole bunch of agriculture until I reached a point where manufactured goods and consumer goods were at base price or lower. With the exception of a couple of things we'll talk about in a little bit, consumer goods are base price or lower. Look at that. Electricity, porcelain, all this stuff. And this includes a lot of industrial goods as well. You can see that I'm producing plenty of ammunition and glass and stuff like that. I've also instituted welfare so that my pops, as you can see here, I've got Social Security maxed out, so that my pops have actual money to buy things. I've got a standard of living of about 16.9. That standard of living could probably be higher if I picked up all the slack with the unemployed, but I haven't done that yet. But I've reached a point where consumer goods are at reasonable prices. I'm satisfying demand. I've also went through and built a whole bunch of infrastructure to satisfy my infrastructure needs. There is a little bit of a problem with it where there are a couple of places in the world, you can see here in Australia, that I've built enough railroads and ports, but they are not staffed correctly, which leads to, even though I've got them subsidized, they're not staffed correctly, and so I've got like a couple of places where I don't have full market access, but that really only affects sparsely populated areas. By and large, the entire world's economy has fully integrated into 100% market access. Let's talk about production methods first. Now, I'm using a set of simplified production methods at the beginning here. I'm going to show you what it looks like when I change these around. But in terms of rural, you'll notice that we're still just using hand tools in most places. I'm not using labor-saving devices yet in my mines, but you can see I'm using the most advanced extraction technologies I can do. My plantations are not using labor-saving devices for transportation, but they are using automatic irrigation. You can tell that I've got my logging camps set up. Again, we're not using the labor-saving devices yet. I am using flash freezing for my fish and whaling industries. And if we go over here, you can tell that I have some advanced PMs set, but not all of the advanced PMs are in place just yet. I'm not using the labor-saving PMs yet because I want to show you what happens to coal and oil when I implement them. But I have a reasonably stable economy now. If we take a look again at market view, you can see that my goods are fairly in decent supply. I could use some small expansion of radio production, but that's related to telephones being in less demand than radios. I could also use more artillery, but there's no way I'm going to get more artillery because of the way the PMs work. I'd have to build more weapons plants, but those weapons plants aren't profitable because there's a glut of small arms on the market. I can't fix that. So if we're looking at this right now, if I'm just using oil for my ports and for my coal mines and iron mines and such like that, you can see that I'm already short oil. And we're going to talk more about oil in a little bit. But I want to make something clear that all I'm doing with oil right now is just using oil for this right here, for these PMs. I'm not using it for any of the labor-saving assembly line production PMs, and we are already short oil. That tells me right away that there is not enough oil on the map. But you saw me clicking out the discovery of fresh oil, and one of the things I did not realize until I annexed the entire planet is that even in 1936, there's resources that have not been discovered yet. It's not a lot of resources, but as I was playing around in the save game and advancing the clock, I would occasionally get, oh, you discovered new rubber, you discovered new oil. These are small amounts that are not going to impact this discussion significantly, but I am mentioning it because I know someone's going to be like, oh, hey, you should rebuild more oil. I'm like, okay, well, yeah, that's just like 3 more oil wells. So I'm staring at this market screen while showing you the entire world controlled by France. To put this in the background while I make my thesis statement for this video. And so the community has been arguing whether or not there are enough resources in the game to supply a proper economy. And my answer to that question is no, but with a big, huge asterisk on it. And I'm saying that even though right now you're looking at an economy that seems to have enough resources to supply 2.5 billion people with enough consumer goods to keep everyone happy. Because as you can see, all these manufactured goods are at base price or lower, with the exception of a very couple of things that I'm having a hard time driving the price down on because their production methods are linked to other things. I'm saying that together because I want you to understand that when I say that there's not enough resources on the market, I'm doing so in the context of a couple of different things. I use the annex cheat to annex the planet. I use the fast build and fasthire cheats to build out a whole bunch of industrial buildings, build out all resource buildings on the planet, and build out the requisite agriculture I needed to sustain the economy, with the goal of getting all consumer goods at base price or lower to see if I could supply the resources necessary to do that. So if we go here to resources view, you can see that like there's nothing else for me to build. Under agriculture view, there's still plenty of other things for me to build, but I don't need any more resources that are agricultural because as you take a look, like the price of grain is really low. I've got plenty of fabric, silk, meat. We're doing fine with tobacco and fish and fruit and groceries. I could expand those further if I wanted to. I could use a little more sugar, but like I've got plenty of agricultural products. We are in no way in a shortage of agricultural products. Look at all the land I could put into cultivation. I'm just not going to right now. I have all of my mines built. I've got a whole bunch of industry built. So I have what may be considered a prosperous economy with a standard of living of 17.1 across the board. Part of that's because my unemployed pops are getting welfare, and part of that is just because consumer good prices are reasonable. Now, I said the world doesn't have enough resources, but if you're looking at this, you're saying to yourself, well, it looks like you've got plenty of resources, but let me explain why we don't have enough resources. You'll notice that I'm only using hand tools on a lot of my farms. I don't have a lot of labor-saving devices in place. I'm not using the transportation PMs. I am doing automatic irrigation. And if we swap over here to industry, you can see that with a couple of exceptions, I'm not using any of the labor-saving PMs. I'm still using blister steel process. I'm going to talk about steel production later. There's a reason I'm doing that right now. And I'm only using electrical engines as opposed to diesel engines for complicated reasons. And so with these PMs, the world economy looks pretty good. But we're starting with these PMs so that you can see how the world economy changes as different PMs are implemented. The first thing I want to note is that I've maximized the possible output of all mines by using diesel pumps and dynamite. These other PMs only just save labor. They don't actually contribute to enhanced production, so I haven't implemented them yet. Which means that when we're looking at this market screen, this is the maximum amount of iron you can make in the game. You can't make any more iron than this. This is the maximum amount of sulfur you can make in the game. So we're looking right now at maximum resource production. You can think of our current production of these mineral resources as our budget. This is the budget we have. It can't go higher than this. It's the same thing with wood too, by the way. There's just not any more wood to produce. Or hardwood for that matter. So if that's sort of our budget for things, what happens when we change PMs? Well, I'm going to show you. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and implement, and this is going to cause a lot of people to be unemployed, but I'm not worried about that right now. We're going to swap everything to tractors or threshing machines, not compression ignition tractors. We're not going to do that yet. Just threshing machines and regular tractors. And we're going to... Now, you'll notice that the demand for engines went up, but I'm still able to absorb that demand fairly easily because even with those PMs selected, you'll notice that wheat farms, they're still not an important part of the economy that consumes engines. We take a look at coal. You still see we have plenty of coal to throw at these issues. Wheat farms added 45,000 demand to coal, but like that's nothing. So using these tractor PMs on enough farms to feed the world didn't put me in the hole in terms of resources. I don't have to suddenly build 50,000 more engine plants that are going to consume 50,000 more units of steel. That's not a problem. Okay. So what do we do for our next PM? Well, what if we add electric fences to that? Well, if we add electric fences, and here I'm going to reset my market prices for a second. Yeah, like livestock ranches just added 45,000 to this. Like that's barely a blip on the radar. So far so good. Plenty, like the changing to PMs I'm doing right now doesn't matter at all. What about putting people out of work with the steam donkey? We're going to put steam donkeys into place, and we're going to go ahead and put rail transportation into place. Now, this is going to cause a whole bunch of unemployment. I'm not worried about the unemployment right now. I just want to look at the consumption of resources. Are we going to have enough transportation and coal to use steam donkeys? Can we automate the economy? Now, I'm not going to implement chainsaws yet. We're just doing steam donkeys right now. Tanker cars. Okay, so we're going to run the clock for just a little bit. You can tell that it's chunking as it's trying to reprocess all that. Okay. We're going to go take a look. Where's coal? There's coal. Okay. Still, yeah. You know what? Steam donkeys, not moving the needle too much. We still got plenty of coal so far. Okay. What about, let's add some labor-saving devices here. Now, we're not going to do assembly lines that use oil yet. We're just going to use all the coal-fired ones. Rotary valve engines, all that kind of stuff. Because assembly lines are a whole different ballgame, and I don't want to. I want to talk about them separate. Okay, so we're going to run that. All right. Now, that moved the needle on demand significantly. Tooling workshops added 146,000 to coal demand by itself. Motor industries also moved the needle significantly. You take a look at it, coal was an underutilized resource before, but now the needle has gone up. We're now higher than base price on coal because of implementing labor-saving devices. Also, demand for tools went up because some of those labor-saving devices do require tools. So that changed things a little bit. Okay. But we still seem to have plenty of coal. Now, it's at this point I want to say, let's talk about oil for a second. So far, we seem to have enough coal and enough other resources, but oil, we're already well past the base price of oil. What's going to happen if I just swap to oil using PMs of assembly lines? Okay, we're not swapping to plastics for glassworks. We're just swapping to assembly lines where relevant. Now, not every factory has assembly lines, as you can see, but the ones that have assembly lines, we're going to swap to assembly lines. Okay, we're going to do that and see if there's any oil. And the answer is no. Tooling workshops by themselves, when swapped to assembly line production, consume basically 50% of the world's oil. Right there. 110,000 oil needed for assembly line production for tooling workshops versus 203,000 possible oil to produce. That's not even counting glassworks, motor industries, all these other things. So when we start implementing certain PMs, oil was already kind of in short supply, but now it's ridiculously undersupplied. We literally cannot supply enough oil. And just to make something clear, just to make sure you understand, it's not like the oil fields don't have labor. They've got plenty of labor. They are fully employed due to the fasthire cheat. But they are not producing enough. And I want to note that I haven't even swapped to oil in power plants. I've not swapped to oil for compression ignition tractors. We're already at the point where we have a resource shortage. If I add to it and we say, okay, well, let's go with compression ignition tractors, which I'm not even sure are a good idea. And then we're going to go add to that chainsaws as a labor-saving device. We're going to run that for a second. Well, what do we see now? Okay, well, now we need 566,000 oil, and we're only producing 203,000. And logging camps and wheat farms, like all of that stuff, those aren't actually the most important uses of oil, but boy, does it all add up. Okay, so if you intend to ever use advanced PMs for anything other than just extracting resources using the diesel pump, which does look at the diesel pump does make your mines more productive, just to be clear. But if you're going to use oil for anything else other than that, you are wasting your time because there is not enough oil in the world. Period. End of story. There just isn't. So now I've reverted back to the earlier save where I didn't mess with PMs. Now I want to talk about iron. Iron is one of the key resources of industrialization due to its use in steel, but in several other industries as well. Steel's the big one, though. And as I mentioned earlier, I was still just using blister process because blister steel process is more efficient in a lot of ways in its use of iron. But I'm going to swap to the electric arc process. Now, when I do this, it's going to throw my economy out of whack, but I'm going to have to make some adjustments that I'm going to show you. So don't be alarmed. Okay, so I've swapped to electric arc process. We're going to advance it for just a little bit. I'm going to re-enable my cheats. Because if I don't re-enable my cheats, autonomous investment's going to get stupid. Okay, now, we very clearly have an iron problem. Like, look at that. It seems like I have a ridiculous problem with iron. But if we go down here, you'll notice that steel is ridiculously oversupplied now because the electric arc process is super efficient. So, in order to fix that problem, I'm going to have to go through and delete a few thousand, that's right, a few thousand steel mills. Here, I can just montage that. I'm going to have to montage this. This is ridiculous. Okay, now that I've done that, let's take a look at my economics. Okay, we can see that steel is down to more reasonable levels. I'm still producing more steel than I need. But if we look at this, it's only negative 33 of base price because I'm only somewhat oversupplying it. And iron here is 35% above base price. So what that tells me is that if I continue to sort of push towards equilibrium with steel, I could probably fix my iron issue completely, and we have barely sufficient iron to cover the economy. Okay, let's talk about sulfur. Now, sulfur in my save game is already 32% higher than base price, and that's because chemical plants are just consuming tons of it. Now, I could change the way my chemical plants are functioning by swapping to, say, nitrogen fixation, but that would use up precious oil, and that would be a waste of time. We are also using brine electrolysis in order to produce the explosives that I need. This makes chemical plants much more sulfur efficient at creating explosives, but makes them less sulfur efficient at producing fertilizer. if we look at my market for a second, you can tell that I need lots of fertilizer. Those wheat farms aren't going to fertilize themselves. But I could build more livestock ranches. There is a reason I'm not doing that. The reason I'm not doing that is if you take a look at this, the profitability of my livestock ranches. We'll take a look at my big mega ranch here in the French Comté area. You'll notice that fabric and meat are starting to be saturated in the market. And trying to force my livestock ranches to produce more fertilizer. But it's going to be an uphill battle to force these livestock ranches to produce even more fertilizer because meat and fabric are already in ridiculously high supply. And remember, in order to do this, in order to produce fertilizer, we have to be using intensive grazing, which does mean we need grain, which is in fairly short supply, but it also improves the output of fabric. So, like, you can't uncouple livestock fertilizer from livestock fabric. Like, those are smushed together to get them both happening. I could swap to, like, open air stockyards to cut my meat production out. That is a possibility here, but I would have to put, let's see, how much land. Let's do a test. Let's see how much land I could put into cultivation with livestock ranches, and let's see how much I could make up. Okay, it took an unbelievable amount of time to queue up livestock ranches because you could put a livestock ranch almost anywhere in the world. And I went from having... Ignore this. This is a bug where the game will let you queue up livestock ranches or other agricultural buildings that actually shouldn't be allowed to queue up. And so they just sit there polluting the construction queue till you delete them. But I went from 5,000 some odd livestock ranches to 22,000 livestock ranches. I had to fiddle around with PMs in order to make them at least semi-profitable. And as a result, livestock ranches are still only producing 100,000 fertilizer. If I go into my PMs and I swap from improved fertilizers to artificial fertilizers, it won't change the amount of sulfur that I need, although it will change the amount of iron I need. So let's see if that'll make life better for me. No. If I do that, I lose so much fertilizer that I can no longer supply my market. I have to have enough fertilizer for those wheat farms because those wheat farms are producing the wine that I need, and they're also producing the requisite grain that I need to feed the livestock ranches that are producing the fertilizer. So you can't use livestock ranches to overcome the need for chemical plants. You've got to have chemical plants that are sitting at least improved fertilizers, or you're just not going to have enough fertilizer on the market. That means that there's just not quite enough sulfur on the market. Now, someone's looking at those synthetic plants and paper mills and going, oh, you could cut your sulfur needs for those. But that won't work either. Let me explain why. If we go to dyes, here, let me reorder those. We take a look at dye production. You'll notice that synthetic dyes are the overwhelming majority of my dye production. And they are more efficient at it than dye plantations are. If we go back to a save where I don't have 22,000 livestock ranches occupying every square inch of arable land on the entire earth, we're going to see that there's only so much dye you can plant in dye plantations. See, I've already planted a lot of dye. I could plant more, but some of these places that have room for dye plantations, you'll notice there's not a lot of labor left in those locations. Even if I put all that into cultivation, it's not going to give me the requisite dye that I need. It's going to be the same situation with livestock ranches, where this number will go up, but I still will need synthetic plants to make up the difference in the amount of dye that I need. Now, let's take a look at lead. Lead is a bit easier to talk about and parse because it's basically just used for glass and a tiny bit in munitions and electronics. Glass is a very weird commodity to manufacture because there are several different ways of manufacturing glass. You can do forest glass, which uses no lead, leaded glass, which uses some wood and some lead, or you can do crystal glass that uses all lead in order to create glass. Then there's houseware plastics, which doesn't change your lead input, but it requires oil to boost the output of glass. Now, glass is a bit of a special good because if you look at it right now, it looks like I've got more glass than I could possibly need because it's only being used for pop needs and food industries. But because I have the fast build cheat on, you'll notice that my construction sectors aren't busy. If I had my construction sectors turned on going full blast, I'd need 117,000 more glass. And if I needed 117,000 more glass, I would actually need to up my glass production a little bit. But I'm already sitting at a shortage of lead. Not enough to hurt my production efficiency yet, but lead prices are going up. And if I try to build more glass works to satisfy even more glass demand because my construction sectors were busy, you'd watch lead prices go even higher. And as we already established, I can't use oil here because there's just not enough oil to do everything. So I would say we probably don't have enough lead. If we take a look at wood, the overwhelming amount of wood I need is for tooling workshops. Now, I can swap my PMs around to cut my wood use down. I don't need it for urban centers necessarily, but expert players of Victoria 3 know that in order to use less wood, I have to use PMs that require glass or steel. And if I do that, that's going to up my need for glass, which we just already established is limited by the amount of lead that I have. So this 100,000 wood's going to probably have to stay there. Interestingly enough, though, you would think furniture industries would require more basic wood, but they really don't. It's tooling workshops that get you. And this is something I've noticed in a lot of games where to have the requisite tools that I need, and you see I've got enough tools for my economy, but those requisite tools end up chewing up more wood than anything else. And that's an odd kind of problem to have because you would think paper and furniture would matter more. But we don't just need to worry about wood, we also need to worry about hardwood. Hardwood I seem to have enough of because it's only used in furniture, war machines, and arms. And war machines and arms aren't super big. It's furniture that consumes a lot of hardwood. And I actually seem to have plenty of hardwood. Rubber. Let's talk about rubber for a second. Rubber, actually, when put into proper cultivation, the only reason I'm burning through so much rubber is because I'm using rubber in my textile mills for this PM right here, the Elastics PM, so that I can make even more luxury clothes from my existing silk supply. If you have the rubber, you should probably be using that PM, and even with that PM in place, we are just fine on rubber. Rubber is not a problem. You just got to get it in production. I'm only going to mention fishing and whaling in brief, other than to say that there should be enough fishing wharves in the world to support your population's food needs. You shouldn't, like, there seems to be enough fishing available on the planet, and that's including using canneries to turn fish into canned food and groceries. Now, I'm not using vacuum canning, again, because that requires oil. If I used vacuum canning, then I would be using up a lot more fish to create a whole bunch of groceries, but it would also significantly increase grocery production, so I could probably cut back on food industries. Again, oil is a limiting factor, so I wouldn't use that PM. we seem to have enough fish on the market. And just to remind everyone, whaling does produce oil, but if you've maxed out your whaling industry, yeah, it produces so little oil as to not matter on the world market. Yeah, it's just a drop in the bucket compared to everything else. So where does that lead us? This all tells me that if you have a world with 2.5 billion people in it who have enough standard of living to actually buy significant amounts of consumer goods, there's probably enough iron and coal and agricultural goods and wood and hardwood and rubber to supply the economy. Lead and sulfur are much more iffy, and we don't seem to have enough of those resources. But I mentioned at the beginning of my video that there's a big ol' asterisk to all of this. And the asterisk to this is the question that I'm going to put forth to the community and to the developers, because I don't have an answer for this question. And the question I have is this: what even counts as enough? When we say enough resources, do we mean we aren't getting throughput penalties, but we're sitting at 50% higher than base price? When we say we have enough of something, does that mean we are sitting at equilibrium at 0% of base price? Or do we envision a world where iron and coal are cheaper than base price and that counts as enough? And I don't have an answer to that because I'm not a game designer and I'm also not an economist, and I don't know as much as I would like to about the history of 19th century economics. Because in absolute terms, I seem to have mostly enough iron and coal to run things. Even if I wanted to automate my PMs, it should be okay. I certainly don't have enough oil, but I would seem to have enough iron and coal. But you saw how iron and coal prices could start to creep up depending on what PMs you were using. And maybe 20% over base price does not count as enough coal. I don't know. I can't answer that question. What does seem clear to me, though, is that player-run economies run well past what the AI can do, and as a result, you have ridiculous amounts of resources in the world that are not developed even by the end of the game. And I didn't show you this in video because it just took forever. But when I annexed the world, I just went through resource view and just built all the buildings using the fastbuild cheat. And it took some time because there were a lot of mines and rubber resource buildings that were just not built. And there were even a lot of fishing buildings that were just never built. And that unwillingness or inability to increase resource output means that when you're playing a normal game of Victoria 3 where you do not own the entire planet, you reach a choke point economically where you could further expand production, but you don't have the resources to do it, and you're just starving for basic stuff like iron and coal and wood. But that's not a resource building problem so much as that's the rest of the world didn't bother to develop their resources. Now, I've watched autonomous investment closely during the beta and now that the beta has been released. And autonomous investment really loves to build resource buildings when demand goes up. So I don't know why the AI isn't building more resource buildings when there's very clear demand for it. That's a question that I don't know if that's just the AI can't build the buildings fast enough or if that's an issue with coding. I did notice that the AI had not built all of the gold mines it could build when I annexed the world. There were 13 states that just had gold mines that weren't finished yet. I don't know why that was happening. That's an easy source of revenue. That does seem like a just AI coding issue. But when we're talking about non-gold resources, as a community, we are seeing shortages of resources partially due to the AI not developing its economy fast enough, and partially because there just isn't enough of things like sulfur and lead. But I would encourage players and members of the community and the developers to talk about and discuss what would enough resources look like. What does that look like? Because I don't have a good answer for that. To me, I could live in a world where I was sitting at sulfur at 32% higher than base cost. It might be unpleasant, but I could do it. But I don't know if that really counts as Victorian levels of resource abundance or resource shortages. I wanted to thank you for taking the time to look at this. This took a little longer than I anticipated because of how the fasthire cheat and fastbuild cheat can sometimes cause game performance to really drag down. This was not the video I intended to put out this week. I actually have a Hearts of Iron video that's in the pipe. It'll be out a little bit later. I have something really stupid in mind for that. But for all my folks that play Victoria 3, I hope that this sort of highlights what I consider to be the problems with late game resources in Victoria 3, which are both problematic and also not necessarily as problematic as they first appear. But whether you're conquering the world or not, or just dominating the world's economy, I hope that everyone who watched this video has a pleasant day.